Hello everyone, this one's the urinary system, chapter 26. The urinary system contains a group of organs that consist of the kidneys and the urinary tract, the uterine, urinary bladder, and the urethra, and performs many functions critical to the maintenance of homeostasis. Most such functions are directly performed by the kidneys. For example, the kidneys filter to remove metabolic waste. The kidneys also regulate the body fluid, electrolytes, and the acid-base balance. It can also regulate blood pressure and reconserve the substance in blood. The physical characteristics of urine, the odor is a slight smell and a pH level balance of about a 6. These are a few key terms. As we move on, the pair of kidneys are against the posterior body wall, posterior to the peritoneal membranes, meaning that they are retroperitoneal. Externally, they are encased with 3 layers of connective tissue, which is a superficial renal fascia, which is a layer of dense irregular connective tissue that anchors the kidneys to the posterior abdominal wall, and the adipose capsule, which is a thick layer of adipose tissue that puts the kidney in place, and the renal capsule, which is a very thin layer of dense irregular connective tissue. As we move on, these are a few key terms for the kidneys. The renal cortex is the most superficial region, which is known as the renal cortex. It is a dark brown because it consists of many blood vessels that serve the tiny filtering structure of the kidneys and the nephrons. The renal medulla, which is the kidney's middle region, is the renal medulla, which consists of triangular renal pyramids. The renal pyramids are separated from one another by inward extensions of the renal cortex called the renal columns. These are just a few examples. Each pyramid contains many blood vessels. Each pyramid also contains looping tubules that drain the structures that drain from the nephron. These tubes give the pyramid the striped striated appearance. The end of the tip of the renal pyramid is known as the renal papilla. The renal pelvis is the fluid from the renal papilla that drains into the tubes called minor calyces, that in turn drains into even larger major calyces. The major calyces drain into the kidney innermost region, the renal pelvis, which serves as a basin for the collective urine. As we move on, these are a few key terms. The blood flows through the kidneys in a unique pattern that allows it to carry its function and maintenance of the homeostasis of the blood. The large renal artery delivers a lot per minute up to the kidneys to be filtered. The renal arteries branch into smaller arteries as they pass through the medulla to the cortex, including segmented arteries in the renal pelvis, the interlobular arteries between the medullary pyramids, and finally the smaller interlobular arteries in the renal cortex. The interlobular arteries branch into afferent arterioles, each which supply a ball of capillaries known as the glomerulus. This is where the blood is filtered. A capillary bed generally drains into a venule. Capillaries of the glomerulus drain into a second arteriole called the efferent arteriole. The efferent arteriole then branches to form a secondary capillary bed known as the peritubular capillaries. These capillaries surround the tubules of the nephron, where they provide them with oxygen and nutrients, and also take substances reabsorbed by the tubules back into the blood. The peritubular capillaries then drain out through the small interlobular veins, which drain into the arcuate veins, and then turn into interlobular veins, and finally into the large renal vein. This pattern of blood flow allows the kidneys to both filter blood and to reclaim most of the fluid that has been filtered. Each kidney is composed of more than 1 million units called nephrons. The nephron can be divided into 2 parts, which is the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. The renal corpuscle itself consists of 2 parts, the glomerulus and the glomerulus capsule. Glomerulus is a ball of looping capillaries Second portion of the renal corpuscle is the glomerulus capsule, which has two layers: the outer parietal layer, which is made out of simple squamous epithelium, and the visceral layer, which consists of cells called podocytes that surround the capillaries out of the glomerulus. The space between the parietal and the visceral layer is known as the capsular fluid. Fluid is forced out of the glomerulus capillaries, entering this space. Once in the capillary space, the fluid is called filtrate. The podocytes of the visceral layer have extended called foot processes that interlock to form narrow filtration slits. The filtration glomerulus endothelium cells, which are the podocytes, and they share basal lamina together and form a structure called the filtration membrane, which prevents large substances in the blood, such as blood cells and proteins, from exiting the glomerulus capillaries. These are a few terms regarding what we are going to be discussing. From the capsular space, the filtrate next enters the renal tubule, which can be a length of the kidney. The renal tubule consists of three parts: the proximal tubule, the descending and ascending limbs of the nephron loop, and the distal tubules. The majority in the renal tubule is confined to the renal cortex. Only the nephron loop of certain nephrons dip into the renal medulla. Several distal tubes drain into the one collecting duct, which is part of a large collecting system that is not part of the nephron. Collecting ducts in the renal cortex are cortical collecting ducts. Those in the renal medulla and medullary collecting ducts near the renal papilla. Medullary collecting ducts enlarge to form papillary ducts, which will empty into the minor calyces. At the junctions between the ascending limb of the nephron and the distal tube, we find a group called macula densa, which comes into contact with portions of the afferent arteriole that continue specializing cells of the juxtamarilis cells. As we move on, this is just a pathway of the blood through the kidneys. Then we have a pathway of kidneys going to the kidneys. And as we move on, this is a few key terms for the urinary bladder. From the renal pelvis, urine enters the next organ of the urinary system, which are collectively called the urinary tract. The first portion of the urinary tract consists of tubes called ureters. Ureters are linked by a type of epithelium called transitional epithelium, and their walls contain smooth muscle that massages the urine inferiorly, peristalsis. The ureter drains into the posterior inferior wall of the organ, which is known as the urinary bladder. The first portion of the urinary consists of the urinary bladder, the ureter, and the uretera or feces. It also contains a detrusor muscle in its walls. The majority of the urinary bladder contains folds called rugae that allow it to expand when it's filled with urine. The smooth inferior portion of the urinary bladder walls feature a triangular shape known as the trigone. This opens into a final organ of the urinary system, which is the urethra, and then the urethra is surrounded by two rings of muscles, and they are involuntary. Then they have the external and internal sphincter. And then as you move on, in males, the urethra is much longer and has three divisions: prosthetic urethra, membranous urethra, and the spongy urethra. The urinary bladder of the female sits anterior to the vagina and inferior to the uterus. The position of this reason is why pregnant women have to urinate so frequently. And then these are just a few layers of the urinary bladder and ureters. The innermost layer is the mucosa, which is composed of transitional epithelium and a thin layer of loose connective tissue. Transitional epithelium is stratified epithelium, which cells that differ in appearance of the basal sides. The cells Sometimes are also called cubitals. The middle layer of the ureters and the urinary bladder is the submucosa, which is composed of loose connective tissue. And the outermost layer of that is the adventitia, which is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. This is a few examples of the tissue of the ureters. Urinary bladder. And that is it.